What does domestic work reveal about the politics of migration, care, and exploitation today? In this episode, we sit down with three leading voices in the field, Bridget Anderson, Rhacel Parreñas, and Sabrina Marchetti, to unpack how migration and labor regimes shape the everyday realities of migrant domestic workers.
We look at how exploitation can happen inside ordinary families, how global care change keep European households afloat, and what our latest iClaim research shows us about domestic work and the irregularisation of migration across Europe.
Welcome to Mobility, Work and Right, the iClaim podcast, where we challenge common misunderstandings about irregular migration in Europe today. I'm Nando, a sociologist based at the University of Birmingham in UK, specializing in migration, forced displacement and citizenship.
And I'm Ilse van Liempt, a human geographer based at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands, and I focus on migration, belonging and citizenship in the spaces of everyday life in Europe. Together we are your hosts for this series.
Our series draws on research from the iClaim project, which aims to cast light on the regularization of migration and migrants in Europe and what it means to those directly affected. The project is funded by the European Commission Horizon Europe Programme and UKRI.
Today we have three great guests, which will help us to think through the intersection between migration and labor regimes and how it affects migrant domestic workers. Nando spoke to Bridget Anderson, Professor of Migration, Mobilities and Citizenship at the University of Bristol and Director of Migration Mobilities Bristol. Bridget is the author of one of the seminal works on migrant domestic work, Doing the Dirty Work, which was published 25 years ago and is still relevant today. And I spoke to Rhacel Parreñas, Doris Stevens Professor in Women's Studies and Professor in Sociology and Gender and Sexuality Studies. She's worldwide known for her work on domestic workers, and today we will talk with her about her latest book that just came out, The Trafficker Next Door. And together we're going to talk to our iClaim colleague, Professor Sabrina Marchetti, who is an expert on migrant domestic work, and she led the iClaim work with domestic workers in our project. Let's start with Bridget Anderson.
Hello, Bridget. We are delighted to have you at Mobility, Work and Rights. This episode is all about migrant domestic work in Europe. It's something that is so central to the work we are doing also as part of the iClaim project. And we thought it would be a great opportunity to talk with you about migrant domestic work. It's now 25 years since your publication of seminal work, Doing the Dirty Work. And I really wanted to hear from you about, what has changed? What is the same? In what ways, your motivation to work in these areas? Tell us a bit about the background to the book, but also how do you bring it into the present?
Well, thanks very much for inviting me, Nando. I think in terms of motivation for the book, it's probably a bit unusual in that it was really the book that made me an academic rather than me being an academic finding a research topic. So after I did my undergraduate degree, I actually became involved in organising undocumented workers. So that was around the mid 1980s, which at the time in London, at least in the UK, was like, it wasn't really a topic. I feel like now if you say organising undocumented workers, everyone knows what you mean. In the 1980s, it was quite different. And so as part of that work, so it was focusing on domestic workers in private households in the UK. And as part of that work, I wrote a book for Anti-Slavery International, whose title I'm now very embarrassed about, called Britain's Secret Slaves. Oh, God, I regret that title. Anyway, but there was a chapter in that book which sort of did a quick overview of domestic labour in different European countries. And I really realised that there was nothing written about it, or there was nothing known about it at that time. So I got a grant from the European Commission to kind of investigate it. And I can't remember now how I got it, and I sort of wish I did, because they basically said, we'll give you this money to do a 6-country study, but we can't just give it to you personally. It has to go to an institution. And so somebody said, well, what? And I was thinking, well, who could they give it to you And then somebody said, oh, you could do it as a PhD. So I thought, yeah, all right, I'll do it as a PhD. So that was basically, and that then in the end became doing the dirty work. And then I moved into academia, and the kind of rest is history, I guess. So it came very much actually from an organizing perspective. An organizing perspective that was also interested in the fact that this was an area where people organized multinationally, which is, again, quite unusual, I think. Even now, I think very often migrant organizing tends to be around country of origin. And I think as well, perhaps for me, what was useful about it, just personally from a kind of development point of view, is when I left university, so I studied philosophy and modern languages. I left university thinking, what a waste of time. And, and got into migrant organizing, as I say. But then I, through doing this work, began to realize, the importance of, for example, histories of the contract and understanding what you're buying and selling. And, I suddenly realized why philosophy matters, or theory matters, in a way which I hadn't actually realized when I was at university.
I was looking again at the book in the last few days, and I found it strikingly contemporary, not just in terms of the empirical basis, but actually also in the way you conceptualize and theorize migrant domestic work. One of the things I wanted to ask you, in terms of who were you talking to? Because, I was looking at the blurb, for example, of the book, and you're talking, for example, you make a point about feminism, about white feminism in a sense, and the extent to which bringing in the migration dimension in the analysis of domestic work adds something in. Do you think that this sort of public for the book, is this very relevant still today, or is something have changed, for example, in that kind of narrative or discourse?
So I think migration always upsets things. It upsets different struggles. So migrant domestic labor, is a challenge for feminism. If you think about, I don't know, housing, migration and housing is a challenge for people that organize around housing. Migration and race is a challenge for people that organize around race, So I think that it's actually a very disruptive force, and part of the kind of limitation, I would say, of migration studies and migration organizing is that it's become its own silo rather than utilizing its inherently disruptive nature. And I think that's actually politically really important, because I think, and we see this happening today, if you don't think about migration, and put it at the heart of whatever struggle it is, then your solutions, your responses, your organizing are going to get kind of, knocked off course. And that's not because migration is the most important thing. But it is politically now made a very important thing. And you have to have an answer, you have to have some kind of coherent response to migration. So I think that, I'm not trying to say everyone has to organize around migration. I'm not trying to reify migration, but I think it is very important. And I think that in a way that's what I learned from doing the dirty work and thinking about domestic labour. So I think that sort of general position, I would say, is helpful today as it was in lots of different areas as it was then.
One of the areas that I'm particularly fascinated about, also because it's very close to the work I've been doing over the years, is really to understand the extent to which migration governance passports are used as weaponized for creating hierarchies within the labor environment, in the work environment. And I think you do it brilliantly already in the book. And it's something that you will continue to do over the years. So I was wondering, how do you think that that's actually the use of migration governance as a tool for regulating labor and also stratifying labor? Is it something that is still there as it was, has changed? What are the trends?
Basically, I think the mechanics are forever the same, but I think actually what that means in practice shifts. So, I mean, Brexit is a really good example of this, as you know. I mean, I think that, there was all this talk about, we need to stop Eastern Europeans coming, and then we can get Indians and people from the Commonwealth coming. Well, how did that shake down? So I think how it's actually utilised, it varies. And I think one of the things that we're seeing now in the UK that, I feel frustrated because I actually put forward a project to look at this in about 15 years ago and didn't get the money, but it was really looking at time and the regulation of length of visa and precarity as a kind of labour disciplining mechanism. And I think that we're seeing this kind of in steroids now in the UK, in the US and beyond. So, on the one hand, this is very old or has been going on for a long time. On the other hand, it's getting utilised in different and kind of sharper ways. And I do think that, and here is an example of where we can kind of bring different fields of research and activism together. So, for example, we know from countless studies that insecurity and insecurity of employment, what's commonly called precarity, is bad for workers and often also bad for employers, some certain types of employers in the long run. We know it's bad for mental health. We know it's bad for skills. We know it's bad for lots of stuff. Now what we're doing is effectively kind of we're creating a whole group of super precaritized labour, which is then also being put in competition with national labour, and which, quite frankly, if you can't access the welfare state, if you're super precarious, that is going to create a class of workers who are more desirable for certain kinds of poor employers. So it's not actually protecting the national labour force. To protect the national labour force, we need to not have people who are going to be driven because they can't access welfare state into accepting poor employment. So I think, we need to join this stuff up and have a more creative, less siloed approach to situating migrant labour in these kinds of conversations.
I think the terms and condition of sponsorships, which is becoming more and more central in the way that migration is organized, the visa system, it's amplifying these dynamics. People talked about sponsorship as if sponsorship is always the same, and in reality there are very different ways of doing sponsorship. There are more liberal, less regulated ways, like sometimes Australia you can use as a model, and the way that Britain seems to be interpreting this sponsorship is really to tie very closely the worker to a specific employer, don't allow mobility between sort of employers. There is the fact that you immediately lose your status if you leave your employer and there is very little time to find something else, which is really amplifying these dynamics that you were already pointing out in the book. In a sense, it almost looks like the domestic workers have been, to an extent, some kind of guinea pigs into seeing this mechanism at play. And I think in the current debate, which is really opening up at the moment about making it indefinite leave to remain, not indefinitive and always probationary, we are seeing this sort of dynamics you were describing, really, as you said, on steroids. And this also led me maybe to another point I wanted to check with you. When the book was published was the time of the New Labour. And again, now, in a sense, after 25 years, we are facing some of this issue now in a new Labour era. And I think, is there something specific at the way the Labour Party, when it's in government, dealt with migrant workers? Is there something particular about it, or is basically just as any government?
That's a really good question. I mean, just on the kind of on the visa thing. So doing the dirty work was written at a time when we'd won the campaign, and actually domestic workers were no longer tied to their employer, and people who had entered in that way became regularized. Now, of course, they've reintroduced the tying of the visa to the employer. And, I'm pleased to say that some of the old organisers are now getting together to support these people who are now coming under this regime and to campaign for their rights. Now, one of the things that was very noticeable at the time was that there was effectively a regularisation, but the new Labour government never called it a regularisation. It's never, if you look up regularisation, this will never appear anywhere. It effectively went under the radar. So, and it was also not a blanket regularisation. So one of the problems we had was that actually the ways in which people came and particularly different nationalities came varied because it was a concession. And so certain nationalities came with a stamp and with the name of the visa of their employer written on the visa. Other people came as family members, were given family member visas, even though it was clear they were workers. And it was proved much harder to regularize in practice people from certain nationalities than other nationalities. So that's an example then of the ways in which these hierarchies are built into the immigration system, the immigration actually, the heads of the immigration officers, because it wasn't that, they were just thinking, they were responding to assumptions, that their own assumptions, but then also even to regularization mechanisms.
One of the things that I think is in a sense unique to the labor in government is this idea that, and also partly it's interesting because when the new government was elected, among the migrants organizing groups, there was some hope that a party that was going to improve the workers' rights, which was was actually including the migrants in the worker rights. The migrant worker as a worker. Instead, what we've seen, at least what seems to me, is that they are weaponizing the worker rights against migrants. So a lot of this anti-migration narrative has become, we protect the British workers against the migrants because all the usual things that have been around. So it's something like almost a narrative that was not that relevant under the Conservative government because it's not part of the DNA from a discursive point of view. And now we are seeing instead this weaponization of what should be something actually positive against the migrant workers. But yeah,
I think that goes to the kind of like, well, but are these laws really protecting British workers or not? So British jobs for British workers. Well, what does that really mean? And I think, so I suppose I would say that in fact, what we're seeing is a highly kind of, I don't even know what the word would be, like middle classes sized process, right? So no, you've got, if you earn this much, then, you're not going to have to wait so long for your ILR. Well, you're just cleaning toilets. Well, in that case, you can wait for 20 years. There's an intense disrespect and disregard actually for certain kinds of work and therefore certain kinds of working people, whether or not they're migrants, that I think should be an anathema to a Labour government, but actually clearly isn't.
A lot of questions could follow, but I would like to ask you maybe a final one about our role as researchers, activists that works in this field. You already pointed out early on about this need, the risk of migration and migration studies as a silo, and what are the kind of research questions do we need to address the moment we are going through now? This is really an important conjunction in many ways, nationally and internationally.
sometimes, so I can't remember the phrase exactly, but Sven Lindqvist says, we already know enough, but do we have the courage to understand what we know? I wonder whether we do already know enough, and whether actually, so I feel that we need to reframe migration completely. We need to reframe the conversations around migration. We need to reframe public debate about migration. And rather than kind of maybe asking new research questions. And once we reframe that, through that reframing, new research questions, I think will emerge.
Thanks a lot, Bridget. And it was great to talk to you about these issues, and hope there will be other opportunities in the near future as well. Thank you.
No, thank you for having me, Nando.
Our next guest is Rhacel Parreñas, who gives us a unique insight into her new book, The Traffickers Next Door.
I'm very excited about today's guest on our podcast, Professor Rhacel Parreñas. For those of you who don't know her, Rhacel Parreñas is the Doris Stevens Professor in Women's Studies and Professor in Sociology and Gender and Sexuality Studies at Princeton University. And she's worldwide known for her work on domestic workers. And today we will talk with her about her latest book that just came out, The Trafficker Next Door: How Household Employers Exploit Domestic Workers. Rhacel, thank you for being on the show with us today. Your book, with the provocative title, The Trafficker Next Door, confronts the reader with very important misconceptions around what trafficking is, but also who traffickers are. And your book actually shows us that the vast majority of trafficking victims are domestic workers who suffer abuse from ordinary family employers. So I just wanted to let that sink in. Yes. Ordinary family employers as traffickers. Yeah. Can you explain to the listener how it's possible that ordinary people exploit domestic workers? What's the mechanism behind that?
So let me begin with just a general overview on human trafficking, and I think that there is a lack of connection between migration and trafficking. Yet we should acknowledge that some of the groups that are most vulnerable to trafficking are migrant workers. So it's really important when we study migrant workers, we look at how they become vulnerable to trafficking, and so that's how I came into this study of examining traffickers, basically as regular employers as traffickers. But we don't have reliable numbers on human trafficking. Many of the numbers released by organizations such as Walk Free or even the ILO are they extract from kind of surveys from like 74,000 people, and they'll extract that information to basically determine there's like 24 million. So it's very kind of questionable how they jump from 75,000 people they surveyed to make an estimate that there's 25 million victims of forced labor and or human trafficking. So while I say that, I want to then acknowledge that the small scale surveys we have from the number of people, let's say, who get a T visa in the United States, and that's like victims of human trafficking who can get a visa, to like the number of people who call in to call hotlines, we consistently get the number that about 25% of victims are domestic workers. And so this is among labor trafficking victims. Experts on the ground also argue that there are more labor trafficking than sex trafficking victims, and then of labor trafficking victims, we can kind of speculate that the largest group are domestic workers. So how do they become vulnerable to human trafficking? So the situation of domestic workers is quite precarious because in all countries in the globe, with the exception of Italy, migrant domestic workers are bounded workers because their legal status, the visa that they have, ties them to their sponsor. And then they're often required to be a live-in worker for that sponsor, and they cannot easily quit their job. And so this is the case, like not only in the Gulf regions, like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, countries that we kind of stereotype as the most brutal towards domestic workers, but it's also true, for example, for au pairs in Denmark, as the work of Helix Denim has shown, or not undocumented workers, but like visitors to like Great Britain, as Bridget Anderson has shown. So it's also the case, for example, in the United States, in Canada, Hong Kong, Israel. So it's not just these like non-Western societies that subject domestic workers to this tied visa status. So because employers have so much power over the domestic worker, sometimes they won't let them quit. So that becomes like a case of forced labor. They'll like overwork them. They like will underpay them. And so they basically, make them work 18 hours a day and not pay them like overtime pay. And so I think, so it's the legal status of the domestic workers, and then coupled with the live-in employment and the difficulty of monitoring what goes inside the home. And so we can actually say that while undocumented workers are not bound, they face another kind of vulnerability. It's like this fear of criminalization exacerbates their or creates a certain kind of vulnerability for them.
And when I was reading your book, I was so intrigued by this concept of the white savior complex, because I think it's very fitting to how the employers legitimize and justify the poor working or inhumane working conditions, and because they believe they're doing a good thing.
So the white savior complex actually is a term that Teju Cole came up with, and he was talking about sort of these like Westerners who go to Africa to try to save them, and then they feel so good about themselves, and it doesn't really matter whether they're really doing something good for people in Africa. It's just like for themselves that they're doing this. So he calls he calls it the white industrial savior complex. So I built from Teju Cole to capture the management of domestic work as being what I call the employer savior complex. And from the many employers I spoke to, they seem to have this idea that their employment of the domestic worker saved this domestic worker from a life of dire poverty and starvation, that whatever labor conditions they get, even though it seems to us very substandard, it's actually an improvement for the domestic worker in relation to where they were before. And so employers will say, it seems bad that they're sleeping on the floor, on the kitchen floor, but actually you have to think about where they came from. They lived in a hut without like a proper roof, and so they would get wet when it rained. Like here, they're like safe. They're like, there's like rain doesn't pour down on them when it rains, right?
So they're the rescuers.
Yes. Or they'll say, I limit what they can eat from the rest of the household, but like, before they came here, they were practically starving. You don't know where they, came from. I mean, they came from dirt. I mean, that's like a straight quote from someone I interviewed in Dubai. It's like, and so I think that makes people feel not only better about themselves, but it blinds them to how they impose substandard labor conditions, because to them, like labor standards don't apply to the people that they employ.
Yeah. Yeah. So
So,
these systems of abuse, they become normalized.
yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so that's like a key, like unconscious tactic, so it's not like they're knowingly doing this. I mean, they're like convinced, like they're serious employers I met are seriously convinced that they're not doing anything wrong, right?
Yeah.
And so
Wow.
then,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
these
You
are,
really unpack that in a very convincing way in your book. Yeah. So we've been doing research in the Netherlands with domestic
yeah,
workers where it's a very different system because they only work for a couple of hours and they have
yes,
different households.
yes,
But in our research, we found that many people don't see themselves as employers.
mm,
They
yeah,
don't think that they are actually an employer. So they don't think about labor standards at all. They just
yeah,
ask for a service and they pay some money and that's it.
yeah. I mean, I'm not surprised by that. That's actually something that um, is very common in just domestic work where um, employers try to downplay the employee-employee relation, and even when they frame it as friendship or kinship, it cloaks the labor dynamic.
Yeah.
And it allows them to kind of justify the need not to improve labor conditions. So, for example, like they won't ever give them a raise, but they'll give them gifts. By giving gifts, it becomes a favor, and the favor is going to be kind of returned as unpaid work. I mean, so then why not just give them a raise and not the gift, right? And so that if you just give them the raise, it's very clear what your relationship is, and you're not able to extract free labor under the guise of a gift, right?
Yeah,
So,
people feel uncomfortable with being an employer.
Yes,
Yeah,
but
that's very problematic.
But that discomfort allows them then to cloak the relationship as one of friendship or kinship, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And something that I wanted to ask you about the difference with Europe, but we already touched a little bit about that. But something that kind of struck me from the book is that you write about the Philippines that facilitate out-migration of people into these risky situations. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the role of the government or the role of the embassy in maybe preventing also exploitation or.
Yeah, I'm happy you asked that because I'm in the middle of a project where I'm trying to do an ethnography in what I call the state management of risk, where I'm studying how the Philippine government, like I don't want to say facilitate migration, which is what everyone says, but I'm saying like how do they manage risk? Because the Philippine government doesn't see itself as a facilitator, even though it clearly is. But so what ends up happening is that they have this Department of Migrant Workers. The bulk of which is like basically doing direct services for migrants. And the direct services they do are oftentimes helping victims. And so then even if like there are no victims, like they're structured to help victims. So it's almost like they are already anticipating that victims will result from the migration process. And so, so while they're doing that at the back end after, subjugation happens, they do have mechanisms to mitigate the likelihood of risk, right? And so they do have many strategies, like they pursue bilateral labor agreements. They mandate a standard employment contract. They have an overseas monitoring system where quarterly every agency has to actually report on the welfare of the domestic worker or any migrant worker. And which is why they're so upset about the Filipinos in Central Europe fleeing to Western Europe because they cannot monitor them because there is, so agencies have to call. So every labor placement agency in the Philippines has a staff member that's a welfare officer. and that welfare officer's sole job is to call every migrant worker that they have deployed.
Wow.
So what you see is so there's kind of a disconnect. You have the process of migration that's heavily regularized to mitigate abuse, but then the actual workplace, which is like nearly impossible to monitor, especially if you are a like domestic worker, becomes this black box that the Philippines cannot really do anything about if something bad happens there, right?
Yeah.
And so, but they can control that process of migration,
but they're not protecting the workers
within the workplace. So of course, they have laws. They try to do the laws, but then the implementation of the laws are questionable. So then there is kind of a more favorable impression or perspective on going to Central Europe right now, because Central Europe. So I've witnessed this, like the Slovakian Department of Minister of Labor went to the Philippines and spoke to the Filipinos and said, trying to peddle Slovakia as this amazing country that they believe in human rights. And so then, and that they, the Minister of Labor was saying, we believe in human rights. We give you minimum wage. And so I guess trying to deploy them to countries that tout their belief in human rights is something the Philippines can do. So that was like, to me, very interesting. How there's this competition now between countries, and certain countries are kind of saying, don't go to Saudi Arabia, go to Slovakia, because in Slovakia, we believe in human rights. It's really funny. But for me, it was like astounding to see these high-level government officials from these countries go to the Philippines to like get workers.
Attract workers.
So they're like very desperate for workers. We're not seeing Western Europeans. We see Canadians go, like provinces of Canada, because they need nurses so badly. But when I was there, it was like these government officials, primarily from Central Europe, are the ones really trying to sell their country as a country of destination. It's so interesting. Even Finland, actually Finland even went there. It was so crazy. It's like, So Finland had this whole like group of businessmen.
Wow. And something that you also write about in the book in relation to trafficking is when people have debts, that they are kind of like trapped because of the debts. Can you elaborate a little bit on how that works?
So Filipino. In the globe, there are, they say 65 million, right? Like domestic workers, and of migrant domestic workers, the vast majority, the largest number, come from Southeast Asia. And so then they're going like everywhere. And so the work of Andrew Mary Paul has sort of tracked this for us. So they're going to, the Middle East, they're going to like Taiwan and Israel, they're going to Malaysia, they're going to Singapore. And so the law in the Philippines is that domestic workers are not supposed to pay a single cent of their migration cost, like not 1 cent. And so certain countries have recognized that. So countries in the Middle East have recognized that and said, okay, like employers, you pay. So employers, to employ domestic workers in their household, have to pay like at least $3,500 to guarantee a domestic worker arriving in their house, right? And in contrast, a country like Singapore does not recognize that law that the Philippines has. So it's a free market in Singapore. And that free market in Singapore has dictated that it's domestic workers that will pay for the bulk of the migration and the placement. And they seem to have this arbitrary system in which they charge new arrivals, the agency does, a total of 3 to 6 months of their salary. So, the Philippines raised that minimum wage to $500 a month. So, the employer will pay for the bulk plus, the transportation. But so there's the fee, that's 3 to 6 months, and then you have transportation costs. But then what happens is once the employer will prepay this fee to the agency who processed the migration. And once they arrive in Singapore, the employer is told by the agency, you can retrieve your money back if you just garnish the wages of the domestic worker. So for 3 to 6 months. And so you have this. So the employers do end up paying about a month to 2 months of that salary of the domestic worker to the agency, but then the domestic workers pay at least 3 to 6 months themselves. So
they work for free.
Yeah, basically. For 3 to 6 months. Yes. Yeah. But in the minds of the employer, they're not working for free because they had prepaid them by paying for the fee that they basically thought the domestic worker is liable for. So this causes a dilemma, a moral dilemma for employers.
Yes.
For some employers, they're just blindly following the system. Some employers face some moral dilemma, and then they decide, I am not going to charge this domestic worker a single cent of the placement fee, right?
Yeah.
But unfortunately, most employers choose to be blind to the human right violation they're committing by not paying their domestic workers for 6 months, right? And sadly, friends of mine have participated in this system themselves, right?
So you need to educate them.
Yes. So it's normal, average people who think they're super nice, right?
Yeah.
I'm nice to my employer. I gave her a bedroom. She has a day off, but I'm not paying her for 6 months, but they don't see it as not paying her. They see it as I paid for her cost of migration.
Thank you so much. Thank you for participating. And to the listeners, you can find all the details about the latest book in the podcast information link. So please make sure to buy and read the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Okay, welcome Sabrina Marchetti. So you are an associate professor at Foscari University in Venice, and you're one of the iClaim researchers in our project, who is actually responsible for coordinating the research on domestic work. You have also been listening together with us to the interviews with Rhacel Parreñas and Bridget Anderson, and we're very curious to hear your reflections and thoughts on their work, but also the connections with the research from iClaim. But maybe can I first ask you about your research interest in domestic work? How did it actually develop?
Hello, hi Ilse. Thanks for this invitation. Indeed, it's somehow a very nice coincidence to have to comment on the interviews with Rhacel and Parreñas and Bridget Anderson, because to tell you the true story, my own interest on domestic work started indeed by encountering totally by accident when I was a student in feminist studies. I was very much interested on issues of power between women, differences between women, what today we would call intersectionality. And I was at that time doing an internship in a feminist archive and library in Rome, in Italy, where I'm coming from. And by chance, I banged into Bridget Anderson's first book, Doing the Dirt Work. And for me, it was a really moment of enlightenment as a way to talk about, as I said, power and differences within women, which is a very important issue. And then immediately after I read Rhacel Parreñas' book, The Servants of Globalization from 2001, And while Bridget Anderson's book was from the year 2000, so they came more or less out, at the same time. And both books also had a case study on Italy. Bridget and Rhacel both made research in Italy. So, yeah, that was the beginning for me, and that's still
the beginning of a long research trajectory. Yes.
Yeah.
And something that really struck me when I was talking with Rhacel about her latest book is the fact that it's ordinary families who exploit domestic workers. Is that something that you have also come across in your work that is more in Europe?
Absolutely. I mean, this is probably some of the most interesting issues that I've encountered in doing research with employers. So interviews, long, in-depth interviews with employers. Sometimes they really are not aware of their position as an employer, what that means, what are the implications. We really need to understand that for some of these people, this is the first time that they are in the employer's positions. Maybe in their own working life, they are employees, not employers. It's also true that these employing a private caregiver in the household usually overlaps with very difficult times in their life, typically when their fathers or their mothers are in a very distressful situation and need care. So this is also a time of very emotional stress for them, and to become an employee is for them a further burden, not something they would wish to do. And sometimes so we really see that this new person in their household arrangement for them is really the one more family member that they would have wished to have. So they expect from them attachment, participation in their everyday life. For example, an example I always make is about employers who are sorry that their care workers, caregiver, is not happy to spend Sundays with them. And of course, this is a right of the worker to have their rest time on Sunday and just go around and meet their own circles. But from them, actually, from there, a frustration maybe starts from the side of employers of thinking, okay, we have a bad relationship, they don't like us, we are not in tune, etc. So this is a just very ordinary example of unknowingly expect something too much from the workers, which is not an abuse. It's a small thing maybe, but is still against the right.
Yeah. And in the I Claim research, we put a little bit more emphasis on the daily life of the workers as well. Is that something like an additional perspective that could help us understand a bit more, the experiences of the migrant workers?
Yeah, because actually this is for the living workers, this is the everyday life is the everyday life of the job, because they work and live at the same place. But in the I Claim project, we also addressed people who are live out, so they work per hour. This is the typical work or organization of the work in other countries, UK, Finland, and the Netherlands, where we conducted research, but also in Italy, we have live-out work. And then we see how the fact of being irregular has also an impact on the everyday life. So although at the workplace they might have very good condition, despite the condition of irregularity, as a migrant, they might have, a correct, let's say, or not abusive relationship. They still are invisible subjects. So if they have any problem in their everyday life, like they need to call the police, they are afraid of doing so, fear of being repatriated, or if they have to access hospital care, or if the children have to access school, or any of these, kind of services, for them is out of reach. So it's important to take the different levels of irregularity, different dimensions of irregularity, and not to think that they always overlap. There might also be disconnections between them.
Yeah, very important. And when we talked to Bridget Anderson, we were kind of like revisiting her work because the book that she discusses has been written 25 years ago. I was wondering, Sabrina, because you have also been researching domestic work for a very long time already. Is there something when thinking back and thinking about the current discussion that is new or like an additional perspective that we would need to further explore in the future, maybe?
The additional perspective, actually, I think that if we also think about what Bridget said, we are in a regressive time. There was a time of important activism by the side of workers. A time she's making the example with the campaign in the UK, but also more recently in different parts of the world, workers have campaigned for the implementation of the ILO Convention by 1989. Different governments have struggled for that. And in this moment, instead, the EU policies on migration and also at the level of some national states are not giving to this labor sector the right importance. There has been a resolution by the EU Parliament on the right of caregivers in Europe, and I don't see that being followed up by movement and by the government. So I would say that we are facing a time of invisibility and silence around these issues from the workers' perspective. There is more attention, this is probably the future, on seeing the entire issue from the side of the care receivers, so the patients of the care receivers, how you want to call them, so the chronically ill or the sick people who are receiving those services. So probably the alliance with them could be a key in promoting again the rights of workers from the perspective of the workers and migrants themselves, which is something that is probably more our perspective, the iClaim project, that can come back, in a way.
Yes.
Another entrance point, probably,
Yeah, because Bridget Anderson was also referring to the fact that we need to reframe migration and we need to find new ways of talking about migration that will also most likely result in new research questions.
What we saw also during the ERC project that I carried out on Equal is that when the rights of domestic workers and care workers are framed as rights of the others, or the migrants, someone external to our society, there is very little space for that improvement. The places in which the government and promoted their rights is when they saw these rights as fundamental, as part of the society, not like giving a favor of granting rights to some alien, to use this technology, coming in and then going out. We really need to see these workers as fully part of the society.
As human beings, yes.
Yes.
Thank you. I think that's a very important quote to finish our conversation with. Thank you very much for Sabrina for sharing your thoughts on these two wonderful interviews, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Mobility, Work and Right, the iClaim podcast. To make sure you don't miss any episode in our series, please subscribe on your favorite podcast provider or join iClaim mailing list on our website, iClaim.eu. We would love to hear your thoughts on today's episode. Share your comments and questions with us via our website or social media. From me, Nando Sigona.
And me, Ilse van Liempt. See you next time.
Bye.